spectrum. What's the best way for authors to, one, avoid stereotypical characters, and two, make sure that their characters are consistent, even though hopefully they're changing throughout the course of the plot?
It's funny. I was actually talking to a client earlier this week, and we were talking about stereotypical characters. And he was very concerned that his characters, one of his characters was coming across as stereotypical. And I was like, well, stereotypes exist for a reason, and you don't have to always avoid them. You know, sometimes there's a reason that you are using it. It's a model we know. And he joked to me, he's like, when it's good, it's a trope. And I was like, well, yeah, kind of. So the thing is that stereotypes do exist for a reason, and you don't want your characters to come across as badly stereotypical. But it's okay to sometimes lean on certain characteristics to kind of telegraph to the reader certain information. But you want to be artful when you do it. And so my best advice for how you can artfully lean on that is, if you're going to use something that's a little bit stereotypical, then you should go into it undermining it. Set us up for one expectation with the character, and then throw us something in their development that totally gets us questioning that. And that often helps lead towards more rounded characters. You know, I think the easiest way to look at this is with a villain character. So often we see villains, so often in books, I see villains doing that great, or maybe not so great villain monologue, where we get the whole kind of breakdown of their entire plan and like how we ended up that way.
Sure, Batman and Robin are tied up to the trap, and there's all the time in the world to talk.
Yeah, all the time in the world, as you know, that saw blade is coming towards Batman's head. And I have edited out that kind of thing so often. But if we see that kind of stereotypical villain and then get a sense of kind of their deeper world, their motivation, if we start maybe getting some facet of them that makes us, shocker, empathize with them, suddenly they're not so stereotypical anymore. They're a little bit more complicated, and that's a much more interesting character to follow. So I think, you know, if you're going to lean into something, then go undermine it. I always want to see characters grow as well. Remember that even your characters that we're not supposed to like so much still have their own motivations and reasons for being, and those need to be reflected in the story too. And they should probably change over time too, because they're, you know, it's all about action and reaction. They're reacting to things, and those things are going to change who they are in some way, shape, or form. Does that help?
It absolutely helps. And I'm thinking, what's the best way to make sure your characters are proactive versus passive? And how can you flip that on its head when you're finding passive characters?
So I always like to kind of think about, is a character sitting there kind of dwelling in their problem, or are they doing something to change their circumstances? So I think often when you have a passive character, it's because they've kind of got mired and they're not doing the clawing out to get out of their circumstances. And so if you find that your character is kind of just being pushed around by the circumstances, then that's probably a place where you've identified a passivity that you need to find some way to break them out of. I think that's probably where I say throw something at them. Throw something at them to make them push back. That often can get you to kind of course correct to get them to move to a more active stance.
So even if a character is being pushed around by fate or whatever the obstacles are,
they have to,
it's not
they
time
have
in the
to find
story
their shape to push through.
I got you. So even if they attempt something and it doesn't work, blows up in their face, at least they tried something that's a proactive character.
Because if it blew up in their face, okay, so it blows up in their face. So then you pick yourself up, and how are they picking themselves up to move forward? Because they, if it blows up in their face and they give up, then story's over. You're done. And it wasn't very satisfying. So it's always about, them finding their little hole in the dark to find a new tactic to push forward.
It helped me overcome one of my #1 pet peeves in other people's writing, as well as my own, is the scene where the character sits and thinks. I forever am trying to tear that out of my own fiction, although occasionally, if you've got a character, I won't have them sit and think. Lord, no, I'll have them doing something, but thinking through the exposition we need to the bare minimum we need to understand to get into whatever the next scenario is that they're headed to, where the plot's going to pick up again. What's the best way to do those expositional scenes without literally having the character sitting there thinking about the exposition?
This is where I find action and reaction and some internal dialogue helps. I think internal dialogue can help to kind of break up a little bit of the too much exposition piece of it. But nothing is more boring than a character just like sitting in a room doing nothing, or two characters sitting in a room, talking, but nothing is happening. I think it's really dependent on what the story is, but if you have a character sitting and you know that you need to get them to another place in a future scene, then I think it can be useful to be like, okay, well, they need to be here in this scene and they're sitting here. How do I, what is the physical action to get them there? And it doesn't necessarily need to be that complicated. And you might not even need to show all of those pieces of it. I see too much description of the minutia action that just doesn't really matter. But if you can figure out some small pieces that are going to work within your framework of your story, if your character is sitting on their bed, they've just gotten up in the morning and they need to get to school. That's why we often see them then, go have breakfast. A little stereotypical here, but we know we need to get them from the bedroom to school. What are the natural steps along the way? And if we start with kind of those breakdowns of it, then often we can get some of that, the small actions we need to keep them moving, even as they're thinking through them.